arriving for the webinar. We're going to give it a minute or two just to let folks settle in, so stay tight. People are still arriving, so let's give it 1 or maybe 2 more minutes. I see we have someone joining us from Morocco, so we're going global today. All right, I think it's time to get going. We have a lot to cover today, so we're going to jump into it while people are still arriving. Welcome to a Public Viewpoints webinar from the Strada Education Network Center for Consumer Insights. The topic is, are student loans worth it? I'm Paul Fain. I'm your moderator. I write a newsletter on connections between education and work that you can read on Open Campus Media. I'm also a senior fellow with Strada. Joining me today is Wil Del Pilar, Vice President of Higher Education at the Education Trust. He works to advance EdTrust's higher education advocacy agenda by developing and implementing strategies to leverage research, policy, and practice to improve accountability, affordability, and student success for low-income students and students of color. Glad to have Wil. We've also got Laura Perna, GSE Centennial Presidential Professor of Education and Executive Director for the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy, AHEAD, at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Perna is a past chair of Penn's Faculty Senate, currently serves as a faculty fellow of the Institute for Urban Research. Also glad to have Laura with us. And Courtney McBeth, Senior Vice President for Strada's Impact Operation, where she's responsible for overseeing efforts related to Strada's Fusion Center, the organization's internal means for maximizing its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to joining Strada, McBeth served as the special assistant to the president at the University of Utah. Hello, Courtney. So this is obviously a hot topic. We're all watching the rapidly increasing student debt levels in the nation, default rates, borrowing and default rates across race and ethnicity, and of course, the policy discussions around debt cancellation, which you may have heard a little bit about. But on the human side, Washington Post and Chalkbeat, Colorado, both had great pieces this week I hope you'll check out on the perspective from individual borrowers. And the event today also is about hearing from borrowers, this time on the quantitative side with some new research. Nichole Torpey-Saboe, Director of Research at Strada Center, is going to run through those findings. I'm going to turn it over to her into just a second. Then we'll have a panel discussion moderated by me of about 25 minutes. During that, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen here. Folks from Strada will be answering them as we speak, and I'll leave some time at the end to ask the panelists your questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Nichole right now.
All right, thank you so much, Paul. It's a great introduction. And as Paul mentioned, the way that we're looking at this issue right now is how can we understand the feelings and perspectives of people who took out student loans. And so what we're going to be looking at are survey data from borrowers. So people, whether or not they completed a degree, but someone who started college and took out student loans. And so this comes from a survey that we do in partnership with the Gallup organization. It was conducted in 2020 in 2 waves. We had a spring wave in April and May, and then a fall wave that went from August to December. And so we have a little over 6,000 people, and it's a nationally representative survey, representative on the basis of education level and race, ethnicity, and region, as well as age and gender. So just to give you kind of a little background on the survey data that we're going to be looking at together. So the first just little context setting, this isn't from our survey, this is data from the Bipartisan Policy Center, just showing how much this has increased. The percentage of Americans holding student loans has increased by 51% since 2007. And we now have about 44 million Americans who hold some kind of student debt. So we know that this is a major issue for many people, and we wanted to understand more about what are people's perspectives on it. Was it worth it to take out that loan or not? So just in our survey, to give you a little context, these are the percentage of Americans of each race and ethnicity and educational attainment level who had some kind of student loans. And so you can see it's pretty high. Even at the low end, at least 30% of people had a student loan. And then at the high end, we see up to 80%. And it's higher for Black alumni and higher for Latino alumni, and also higher for those who have graduate degrees. So the main question we're going to be looking at is this one: was it worth it to take out your student loans? So when we look at this overall, we see about 50-50. 50% of people, of Americans who have a student loan, say that it was worth it to them to take out that student loan. So then underneath that, though, we know that the experiences vary tremendously. And so we wanted to understand a little bit more, what makes it worth it or not to have a student loan. So the first thing we look at are just some of those dollar figures. How much does it matter, the loan amount? How much does it matter how much money someone is making? How is that related to their feelings about whether loans were worth it? So when we look at the amount taken out, we see not necessarily a completely straightforward pattern. In general, people with lower loan amounts are more satisfied than people with higher loan amounts. But we do see for the category who have that $75,000 or more, that they're a little more likely to say that it was worth taking out a loan. And so, that may be graduate school or, some kind of an institution that was more expensive, but it's not a completely linear pattern there. Likewise, when we look at income levels in general, people who are earning the highest amount of money are much more likely to say that it was worth it to take out loans. But it's not just a straightforward pattern. The least likely to say that it was worth taking out student loans are people in that $36,000 to $48,000 annual income range. And then you have people a little bit more satisfied who are earning less. So seeing these figures just made us think, excuse me, what else do we need to understand about borrowers? What else is underneath some of these differences? So next, we wanted to look both at attainment level as well as race ethnicity, because we've seen a lot of disparities in terms of default rates. And, we know that there are gaps in terms of income and wealth by race and ethnicity. So we wanted to understand how these factors are also related. So when we look at this broken down by educational attainment level, this is not surprising. This is kind of what we would expect. People who stopped out, only about a third, 32% of those, felt that it was worth it to take out a student loan. Those who completed an associate degree is higher, and then if people completed a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree, they're much more likely to feel that it was worth taking out their student loans. At the same time, we also see these differences by race and ethnicity. So we see that Black borrowers are least likely to feel that their loans were worth it. Latino borrowers are also less likely compared to white and Asian borrowers to feel their loans were worth it. So, we know educational attainment varies by race, ethnicity, as do some of those other factors like income. And so we wanted to understand, well, we have all these different things. How can you disentangle what's important? And so what we did was run a statistical model, putting all of these factors that I've just covered all in the same model to see what really predicts whether or not someone felt it was worth it to take out a loan. So what we find here, we're holding income and loan amount constant. And then when we look at these variables of attainment level and race ethnicity, we still see that there's very big differences. So again, people with bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees are much more likely to say that it was worth it to take out a loan. Even within the same attainment level, we see differences by race and ethnicity. So we see about a 10 percentage point gap, for example, between Black borrowers and white and Asian borrowers in terms of whether or not they feel it was worth it to take out a loan. So, there's still more we need to understand about this. The last factor that we wanted to look at was, how does it matter what kind of connection a student received in terms of connecting their education to a career? We know from our previous research that this is a really standout factor in a lot of the things we look at. When we look at whether people say in general that their education was worth the cost, not just loans, but education overall, this is a really big factor, and as well as being tied to people's motivations for pursuing education. So we wanted to understand, if a school provides strong support for students to get a good job, how might that influence those perceptions about student loans? And what we found here was that this is really the most powerful factor of anything that we looked at. So what you can see here is people who disagreed that they had those resources and support, only 9% thought that it was worth taking out their student loans. Whereas for people who agreed, no matter what kind of educational attainment level or any of those other factors, people who agreed that they had resources and support to get a good job, 72% felt that it was worth taking out student loans. So we see that this is a really, really powerful factor. So lastly, what we wanted to do is, what if we put that back in the model that we were looking at earlier? When we're holding all these other variables constant, what does this link look like between support to get a good job and feelings that student loans were worth it? So what we see here, on the bottom, you see the full scale for that question about whether their school provided resources and support to help them get a good job. And here we're also showing race and ethnicity. And so you can see two things. First of all, you see the very strong relationship for all groups, for all alumni, between support to get a good job and feelings that student loans were worth it. You can see that upward trend. The other thing that I think is really notable is that the trend is stronger for Black alumni. So in particular, you see when Black alumni strongly disagree that they had those resources and support, only 16% think it was worth it to take out loans. Versus if they strongly agree, then you're up to 84%, and there's no longer any gap between the perceptions of Black alumni and white alumni, for example. And all the groups are much closer together when they strongly agree that they had those resources and support to help them get a good job. So we see this as just something that is beneficial to all students, but can also close some of those gaps we see in feelings about the student loans. Just to kind of summarize what we looked at, we saw overall about half of those with student loans felt that it was worth it to take out a loan. And we see that it's higher for people with bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees. We see that Black and Latino alumni are less likely to feel that their loans were worth it compared to white and Asian alumni. But we see that when those career connections are strong, perspectives really shift, and those gaps between people of different races and ethnicities close. So again, we feel like this is a factor that deserves more research, and I think we're going to get into that with some of the discussion next.
Great, thank you, Nichole. Obviously a lot to unpack there. One clarifying question from an attendee: can we break out those numbers across sectors, for-profit, nonprofit, public?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I did a little looking at this. Our data did not have a robust sample size for-profit institutions. And then there weren't major differences actually between nonprofit and, or rather private nonprofit and public institutions. That's a really good question, but we just don't have the data on the for-profits.
Great. Well, I know I'm going to be asking Dr. Perna about potential future research, and that could be part of it. Nichole, I think you're going to stick around to answer questions, potentially jump into the panel, but let's get right into it. Let's start with Wil. I know Ed Trust is following these issues closely. Anything about the findings jump out to you in particular? Seem right? Seem wrong? Seem surprising? What hits you most?
I would say there's three things that I found quite surprising, and I think someone hit on this in the chat. The fact that 50% felt like their loans were worth it, not their education. So I do want to make a distinction. We're talking about satisfaction with their student loans, but 50% agreed. That means another 50% didn't, and so I think that's to me that's striking. The second thing I would say is that, I was struck by the racial ethnic differences and the satisfaction ratio. When you look at, for example, Black borrowers compared to white borrowers, there was a 15 percentage point gap, right? And I would call that the equity gap, which we do in a lot of our work, is looking at the equity gaps that exist. And part of that may be because of gaps because of the racial wealth gap, right? So Black borrowers have less wealth, so they may be less satisfied because of their experience with debt and racism in the workforce. And then I would say the last thing is the importance. I was struck by the importance of resources, especially around the career supports. I think that when you looked at that graph and there were differences by race, ethnicity, it really kind of makes me think about the institutional resource equity issues that exist, where some institutions have more resources and can pour more into it than other resources. And then I'll just say the last thing was the first slide, the fact that since 2007, there have been a 51% increase in student debt. And I think about state disinvestment and how, because of state disinvestment, we are putting more and more of the burden on students and families. And the way we've done that is through student debt. And so I'd say those are the things that I was struck by.
That last point, I think, really helps gels with your first point, that this is not a "is college worth it" discussion, and that if more public support was available, more folks might not be taking out loans or as large loans. Thanks, Wil. So Dr. Perna, how about you? What sort of gaps in the research does this help fill? Anything about the findings that particularly jumped out at you?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for the opportunity to be part of the conversation. I want to uplift a few things that I think are really interesting about this work. And I think, of course, stimulate questions for additional research as well. I think the focus on perceptions is really important and interesting. We have a lot of data on actual borrowing rates and amounts of borrowing, but people make decisions based on their perceptions. They decide where to go to college, whether to use loans based on what they think about them. So I think getting at perceptions is really interesting. I also like the focus on getting a good job. People go to college to get a job, and much of the conversation that we have in higher ed, understandably, is around enrollment and completion, but we also need to be thinking about how well are we doing in helping people make that transition from education into good jobs. Another observation is I think that the findings underscore two aspects of loans that are risky and that we have to, from the perspective of students. So not completing a degree, stopping out, is a risk for students, and it is associated with lower perceived value, as is not getting a job. That's, even if you do graduate, there's a risk of not getting employment that pays well enough to repay the loan. And from the perspective of a student, that's a risk that we in higher ed, I think, have to be paying attention to. And then, building on some of the things Wil just said, I think the findings really point to how the need to borrow is a practice that on the surface seems fair. It's something that we just have as part of our system. But when we look at these data, as well as other data on, related to this, the need to use loans right now is a practice that masks racial injustice and inequity. Right? Black students are more likely to borrow. They borrow higher amounts. We see here that they have lower rates of feeling like it's worth it, even for graduates. employment rates and other outcomes are lower for Blacks than for other students. It's not surprising. I think that only 38% of Blacks agree that loans are worth it. A key takeaway is we in higher ed administration and policy have to do better on these issues. There's real problems. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's turn it to Courtney. Obviously you've come from a higher ed role fairly recently. Can you talk a little bit about what the implications of these findings are for the industry itself?
Sure. Thanks, Paul, and great to be here with everyone. To me, the real key takeaway in terms of practical implications for our higher ed leaders, and I know we have many attendees here from different types of institutions and different institutional roles, but I think this finding that alumni are 8 times more likely to feel like their student loans are worth it if their institution, if their university or college gave them support and resources to get a good job. So that to me is a really striking finding that then leads us to think about, okay, so how are institutions really supporting students to get a good job? What do the career services offices look like? How do you structure customized internship and apprenticeship type programs? And how do you do that in a way that's equitable, right? So not every student can do an unpaid internship. So how do you structure paid internships? How do you ensure that those experiential learning opportunities are available to all students? And so it's everything from doing research with a faculty member to doing an internship on campus, an internship off campus. How do you structure those in a way that really help bolster their academic experience, but then smooth that pathway to the career, and the timing of those matter, how they're supported, do they get academic credit for it? There's so many programmatic elements to offering career advising and how you set up those experiential learning moments that help, we know, students not only path into a career, but also complete their degree. So to me, this point it's sort of dual prong, right? Because we know high impact practices, those experiential learning experiences for students not only help them get a good job, but they also help them complete. So to Dr. Perna's point, ensuring that institutions can do a better job at providing those career supports and those experiential learning moments, help the student complete. They also provide them with those resources and those connections to the careers that clearly show from these data that it helps students feel like their loans are worth it.
Thanks for that. I want to talk about the perception piece here a bit. Adding this to the broader context of what some findings show is a crisis of confidence about the ROI of higher education. Folks' concerns about affordability. We've been hearing this for a while. It's not getting easier for people. We're seeing enrollments decline among underrepresented populations. How concerned are you, Wil, that people's worries about debt may be preventing them from enrolling in some cases and accessing the best ticket to the middle class that the college degree still is?
I mean, I'm very concerned. And if you're tracking the NSC data, the National Student Clearinghouse data, you see double-digit decreases among first-time enrollees. Part of that may be because of the experience, but another part of that may be due to affordability issues. We're doing some work at EdTrust on Black student debt. We did a national Black student debt survey, and we collected over 1,300 responses from Black borrowers, and 51% of Black borrowers report not receiving a positive return on their student loans. And when asked about income-driven repayment, and over 72% of our borrowers are in income-driven repayment, they described it as a lifetime debt sentence. If we continue to burden students, especially low-income students and students of color, with debt that's not manageable, and then we're going to continue to see students opting out of higher education, and the attainment gaps that exist in this country by education level are only going to grow. When you think about educational attainment, 31% of Black Americans and Black adults in this country have an associate's degree compared to 47% of white adults. That's 21% for Latinos. nearly 22. And so if we're going to close those gaps, we need to address affordability in a way that's comprehensive, because if not, we're going to continue to see these gaps grow.
Absolutely. And when I think about questions of whether higher ed has a problem that needs to be fixed, the default rates for Black borrowers being 50% over 12 years, that pretty much says it all to me. Dr. Perna, you mentioned the role of higher education in ensuring transitions to jobs. I think not fully accepted by the industry. I think that's fair. I think there are some folks in the industry who feel that they can't control the economy, that there are pieces of it that they can't do, and perhaps they're being piled on for some of the economic hardship in the United States and around the world. But what's your take on that? I mean, how I know this is a kind of a nebulous question, but how much is this sinking in that this is something you really have to focus on, not just access and completion?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, so I think we've long had the conversation about, from the employer's perspective, right? The dissatisfaction with the education, the training of workers, and then thinking about, well, how should education be provided? For me, I'm increasingly worried about the data that show lower labor market outcomes for people of the same educational attainment levels, and differences by race, ethnicity, and income, and other demographic groups. So, we in I have long said, higher education is so important to individuals, it's important to our society, and of course that's true, but it's playing out differently for different people. And when we have a system that relies on folks to engage in loans, which are risky, to get access to those benefits, I think those things together are problematic. And so, I'm just hearing more and more as I talk to people at various different levels, folks who are working with first-gen low-income students from racial, ethnic, minoritized groups, about the ways that they're trying to help support with the career transitions. So I don't see it as a need to rethink the curriculum, and I'm sure there are others who would take that point of view, but I'm thinking more in terms of how we can, along the lines of what Courtney was saying, thinking about how we build experiences that help make the transition for people and provide some of those additional types of supports.
I want to throw this one, and this comes from someone in the audience to Courtney and Wil. I mean, how much about the inability of colleges and borrowers' minds to do enough on career supports is about under-resourced institutions? Community colleges, we all know, struggle to provide advising services. Sometimes you've got ratios of students to advisors 1,500 and up. And Courtney, you described a few tools that higher ed can use to do better here, but how much can we do as an industry when there's not enough funds to provide supports?
Right, Paul, that's such an important point. And the reality is that we have many institutions that are under-resourced now. And so maybe I'll just add the thought that given all the changes during COVID, despite knowing that many institutions are under-resourced, how can all institutions be more creative in thinking about how they can provide some peer mentoring? So for, just throwing out some ideas, how, can we offer more paid internships for juniors and seniors that then serve as peer mentors for incoming freshmen and sophomores? So that way you ensure persistence with your freshman, sophomore, you're providing paid internships and a paid experience for your upperclassmen. What are new ways that we can think about pairing more sort of virtual peer mentoring, on-campus jobs, and just being a little bit more creative than thinking about a static career services office where you have, 10, 20 staff sitting in a physical office in a building somewhere on campus, working 8 to 5. Perhaps those people should be working virtually. They should be actually offering the services from 5 to 10 p.m. at night, because people are going to school and working jobs, and maybe that's when they need the career support. So I think this is a moment when institutions should just sort of throw out the usual playbook and start thinking really creatively how to leverage technology, and think about sort of these multi-purpose creative ways to provide that career support.
Absolutely. Will, anything you want to add there on the resource-strapped college piece?
Yeah, I think that, overwhelmingly what happens in this country around higher ed, especially, is that we send the students who attend the most poorly funded K-12s to the most poorly funded higher education institutions. Sarah Garcia, who used to be at CAP, the Center for American Progress, did some research on that. And she found that students of color attended institutions where they received $1,000 less in funding than white students. And so if we're investing less in students, it's not about institutional strategy. It's about a lack of institutional resources to provide the wraparound services. She estimated that we're investing approximately $5 billion less annually in educating students of color in higher ed than we were investing in educating white students. And so when you have these kind of disparities, you can't say it's a strategy issue. It's an issue of resource equity. And until we invest more in students, especially those students who are attending the most poorly funded K-12 schools, we're going to continue to see disparities, not only in outcomes, but disparities in some of these satisfaction around student debt.
Thank you for that. A question for Nichole here from the audience about the timing of the data collection and how the pandemic may have impacted the results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. In some extent, it's not exactly knowable because we didn't have this exact question before, but I mean, some of the things that we've seen just in general about perceptions of the value of higher education, we see that people who already have degrees, those perceptions have been very stable from before and during the pandemic. And in general, people who have degrees tend to say that their education was worth the cost. But it's really the perceptions of people who haven't gone to college that we've seen a lot of skepticism growing. And so we've done some research looking at adult learners, potential adult learners considering going back to college, and seen really big drops just between 2019 and 2020 in those perceptions about whether or not education would be worth it. Just much higher levels of skepticism in terms of, the value of those, which is a paradox when we've seen that, in the pandemic recession, people with higher levels of education have done much better. But yet the perceptions about whether or not higher education is worth it are actually getting more negative among people who don't have college degrees. One other thing, though, that I want to mention on that, though, is in terms of, the differences we talk about by race and ethnicity, is we actually tend to see much more positive views of higher education from, prospective students who are Black and Latino compared to white students. So, but we see higher barriers and challenges, so we see in those communities a lot of desire for education and intent to enroll, and feelings like, they think it's important, but yet, these are the communities who've been hardest hit and most had to cancel and change their education plans at the same time.
Thank you. I kind of asked this already, Laura, but just listening to Nichole there, I feel like the last few years we've learned so much about borrowing and default and breaking the numbers out by demographics and ethnicity. What are some of the questions? I mean, what do we not know? What are you worried about in terms of borrowing that might be lurking in numbers we haven't seen yet? Or do we feel like we're getting to know the scope of the problem, and even now something about perception?
I think there's a lot more that we need to know for lots of reasons. So we have a diverse population and people coming to higher education from a variety of different places and places broadly defined. And then the context does matter. This question about the transferability of the findings from data collected in the pandemic is just really interesting. It could be that these findings reflect a more pessimistic view of loans if people were experiencing economic and health and other challenges, as we know that they were, right? On the other hand, some respondents may feel loans more positively if they were benefiting from the pause in repayment through the CARES Act, right? And so I think building on your question, Paul, I think disaggregating and really trying to understand more the experiences of different people who matter for different reasons as we try to think about the questions we want to answer and the practices we want to try to examine and improve. You know, I also wonder whether and how perceptions of loans might be different and vary and then have different implications. So for example, the parents who are in that sample and how their perceptions of loans influence how they assist their children with their education and their educational costs. That's probably a different perspective than the younger people or people who don't have higher education, adult learners and traditional age students who are thinking about whether they should use loans. I think we need more, understanding more the perceptions of loans among adult learners and people who would really benefit from going to get college education is really important. I'd also like to know more about perceptions of loans among those who stop out. There is a question in the literature about whether some students stop out because they have loans or right? Which is the direction of causality on those perceptions of values of loans. I also wonder about, and you mentioned this, Paul, the perceptions of loans for people who aren't in this sample. So people who decided they didn't want to borrow and so they didn't go to higher education. So we know nothing about what they think. And that's another really important group. I wonder how people think about value. What does worth it mean for different people and how does that vary? And then I would love to know more about, so the question I think is about perceptions of institutional support for getting a good job. I'd love to know more about, what is good institutional support and what is a good job from the perspective of individual people.
Excellent stuff. I hope people were taking notes there. When I hear about the skills gap and whether or not it exists, I think there's a pretty strong belief that there's an information gap, that students don't know what they're taking loans out for. And that's probably particularly true if you're a first gen or lower income student. How much better can we do, or what's some low hanging fruit where we could do a better job of telling students, hey, you're borrowing for X and it's risky or safe or what have you? I mean, how much more work do we have to do there, Wil? I'm thinking a lot.
I mean, I wonder, how much more information we need to provide students. I think there are states that are doing interesting work, but when we asked Black borrowers in our study about this, they knew that they didn't feel like they had a choice, that the only choice in order to enroll in higher education was to take out the loans. They understood that that they were going to have to repay them. They understood that they were going into debt, but they also thought that it would lead to better employment outcomes. They didn't always anticipate the racist labor market, and so I think that we can do a better job at providing students with information. But when a student feels like they don't have a choice, more information isn't going to change whether they want to continue or go into higher education. So I think that that's something that we really need to look at. Like, we need to provide better funding options. And I know this isn't a policy conversation, but there are things that can happen on a policy side to really impact affordability especially for low income students. And so I would say that. The other thing I would just say quickly is that when we looked at this, like in terms of paying off, I had to take out the debt, but I thought it was going to pay off. Median income for borrowers in our study was $60,000. Median debt was $72,000. So they borrowed more to get the education that wasn't paying off on the back end, and there were a lot of reasons for that.
Anyone else want to jump on that one? I've got, yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I think about information all the time. I think it's critical for us if we're going to try to address these issues. And there are several issues that I think are really important. There certainly is a lot of information out there. I think institutions have to really take a good look at how they are communicating information to their own students. My team did a study on net price calculators. There's other research on student financial aid offer letters. There's misleading information out there. Not all institutions are making it clear the difference between a grant and a loan, and they're missing opportunities to help people really ensure that all people understand this is a loan and this is what this means. I think we have to really be sure we're doing what we need to do there. I also think and hope that there'll be more attention to the mechanisms, information about both information and actually how they are working. These programs that help around loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment, there's a lot of complexity in dealing with loan servicers and trying to figure out how to manage repayment. And it seems to me we could make that easier for people to understand from a systematic and a policy perspective.
So as Wil suggested, didn't want to just talk about policy solutions, but it's not off limits. And I'm going to turn to an audience question. It's a bit of a hot potato. But for the rest of the session, though, I'd like to continue to use audience questions. So keep them coming. So income share agreements, very loosely defined when a student's tuition is covered in exchange for an agreement whereby they're on the hook to repay some of that based on their income. Lots of devil in the details there. Let's start with Wil and then turn to Courtney. We could have a whole discussion on this, but is there enough there in your mind, Wil, that this could be part of a solution for folks?
I don't see it as a viable solution. I know that there are more folks in the space that are engaged around ISAs, but overwhelmingly going to create the same disparity. Wealthier students don't have to participate and low-income students have to participate, and you pay a share of your income over time. If the right guardrails are in place right now, I'd say ISAs are kind of the Wild West. There aren't any federal quality guardrails. So, I do think that that folks are exploring it. I don't think it's a long-term solution because you ultimately end up at the same place. A portion of your income is going to have to go monthly usually for 10 years is the term, towards repaying what you borrow. It's based on how much you earn. It's not based on your amount. So you actually may end up repaying more if you're in a high-paying job. If I was in a high-paying job, why would I going to a high-paying career, why would I take out 10% if I'm going to overpay? So I think it's not a solution that I like. I would rather see us double Pell, do federal-state partnership to improve investments and improve, kind of accountability in higher ed than see ISAs become, kind of a trend nationally.
Courtney, you want to jump in on that?
Sure, I'll jump in. And Wil's exactly right that the number of ISA programs and what that compares to the $1.7 trillion student loan debt it's a drop in the bucket right now, but it is receiving sort of outsized attention. And I worked on helping develop a pilot ISA program at the University of Utah. And Wil's exactly right that the devil is in the details in terms of what the program design looks like, in terms of the income share, the max payment cap, the term limits, et cetera, and how you construct the program, and ensuring that it doesn't, favor male-dominated fields, for example. In terms of the downside risk, there is potential there to help ameliorate the wage gaps between race ethnicity groups if the different levers in the program design are done in the right way. But it is the Wild West right now, and there's a lot of different programs out there, and we're all just trying to really learn how they're structured. And again, it gets to the complexity of what Dr. Perna pointed to in terms of how do you service ISAs over time and the complexity of that. I will note, I'm in the middle of a research project right now with a colleague, Jason Taylor, where we're looking at student perceptions of ISAs. And we're doing a mixed method approach. And what we're finding, we're in the middle of this study right now, but what we're finding is pointing to the fact that students are fed so much information in terms of financial aid. It's not only the initial offer letter, but it's once they get into that junior, senior year, and when there's typically less scholarship money available, then they're inundated with so much information through email, calls, etc., that it's a very complex landscape for them to figure out what's legitimate, what's clickbait, what's, you know, a private predatory loan. And in this case, we were really digging into the university email and outreach campaign done for the ISA program at the University of Utah, and just hearing students' perceptions of how they view the incoming information around financial aid options. It's very complex, particularly for students who are first gen, or maybe their students or their parents, you know, don't speak English or don't come from a background where they can help them sort of sift through all the information. It's a very complex landscape, and institutions simply just need to do better in learning how to communicate with students about all their different financing options.
Thank you. That was very brief for an ISA discussion and in depth as well. So I'm going to read a question here. In my work with adult students, I found that too many working adults took max loans out while their living costs were fully covered. How about working on minimizing the amount of borrowing? The financial aid regulation suggests that financial aid offices should offer the maximum loan amounts. It's been an issue for years. I haven't heard it discussed much. Anyone want to talk about loan counseling by colleges and whether or not that's something that should be revisited? I guess I could start with Laura if you want.
You know, I haven't looked at this issue in a while, but it certainly seems like it's something that should be looked at, you know, especially if we know some circumstances where people are taking on a lot of debt. And so, yeah, I don't really have much to add on it, but I think it's an important issue.
Can I jump in there, Paul?
Yeah.
You know, in our research, we haven't seen that students, in many cases, their full cost of the full cost of education, not just tuition, are covered. If that was the case, we wouldn't see as many students who are food insecure and housing insecure. So I would say that we see that less often than we see significant gaps in students' financing. If a student is Pell eligible and they attend a community college, usually a full Pell covers the cost of tuition. Where students struggle with are all of the other costs around education. So an adult student may have their full living cost expenses are covered in their aid package, but what doesn't go into an aid package is, for example, if they have childcare, they have to figure out then how to pay for that, and that's not a part of creating a student budget in financial aid. That's left out, and we know that in many states, the cost of childcare is equivalent to the cost of tuition at a public community college. So, you know, I'd say that maybe we're seeing that, but we're also not taking into account all of the students' expenses that may lead them to have to take out the maximum.
Absolutely. And before I turn to another question, a comment from the audience referring to research by Leslie Turner and others, which and this is recent research, suggesting that increasing loan amounts on the margin can help improve student outcomes. So backing up some of what you said there, Will. So this question, given how important it is for grads to get good careers, why do colleges typically spend significantly more to get students to matriculate than they do to help them find pathways to a better life? There's a lot in that question. Let's start with Courtney on that. And we're talking about spending on marketing admissions versus career connections, and if that's changing.
Right. Well, we all know in the last 3 or 4 decades, there's been this real focus on completion. I think there's many of us in the field that want to see it go to completion with purpose and value, meaning getting institutions to really focus on that path to the career and how we better support that. And I'm noting the comment from Greg in the chat here, and I'm actually a graduate from the Penn Exec Doc program myself, and it was an amazing program and really launched my career. And I think that's an example of a program that's designed in a way to really path you to your next job. So it's designed in a cohort model with other senior leaders in higher education institutions. And all of the curriculum is built in a way that integrates in current relevant higher ed work skills, and is very much done in a way that helps you build that social network, that social capital with a national network of peers, and is how I pathed to my next job. So I think many institutions could use the exercise to rethink how they structure their curriculum, particularly in the last 2 years, and how to build in more sort of cohort and pathway to internships and externships, et cetera, no matter what the field is, but making sure that it's done in a way where there's actual financial support, which could mean bringing in more employers, right? How do we get more employers to jump in and offer those paid internships to create those pathways?
Will, anything you want to add there in potentially skewed priorities and college spending around this?
I think Courtney's point is so valid and so critical, because I think students, when you think about the first job you get, oftentimes is based on the exposure you had when you did an intern or an internship or some external external activity that wasn't related to the school. I think we were hiring recently, and when you're looking at, for example, junior level analysts or entry level analysts, you're able to, a lot of times the folks who have the biggest advantage are people who could do unpaid internships in the space. And if you're doing that, you're providing more opportunities to students who can afford to be in DC, in the DMV area, and do an internship and have support from parents who can help them pay for all of the costs associated with being in DC for the summer. And so until we find ways to provide broader exposure to students that are paid opportunities or opportunities that allow you to get experience in the field, we're going to continue to see disparities, and especially in first, and someone was talking about salary, first year post-graduation salary, we'll see significant differences for students until we're able to get more students the exposure that helps get that first job at a better salary.
I just want to add to that, Will, because I ran a Washington, D.C. internship program where we, I would joke that our program was the rich aunt for every student, where we could get them the connection into the Supreme Court or a congressional office or, international development agency. We provided the housing and we provided a monthly stipend so that they could live in Washington, D.C. And then that stipend could go towards their airplane ticket as well. So it's those experiences that provide the wraparound support, the resources to help a student have the internship experience, to get the mentor, the connection, which then opens the door to the first job, which universities just have to put as a priority to ensure that students get the good jobs and they can then, realize the ROI of their degree.
Yeah, if I could just jump in really quick, I think this really ties to, we know that advising is so important for students, but that universities themselves they don't even have necessarily the expertise to advise the students in all these careers. And so what we really found in our data is that students find they get the most helpful advice from employers, from if you have that kind of experience, if you have that exposure. And so that's something that can't necessarily even happen inside the university, but it has to happen by making those connections available to them while they are students. And otherwise, we see those disparities between students of color and first generation students and others that don't have those relationships to get that advice about how to transition to a career.
Go ahead, Laura.
I know we're almost out of time, but I think several really important points have just been made that I just want to amplify. So there's conversation here about, and I'm going to speak from the perspective of this role and responsibilities of higher education institutions and policymakers, but we have to be honest about what the total costs of going to college are, right? It's more than tuition and fees. And if we want all people to be able to engage in the educational experience, we have to recognize that people also have to live. They need places to live, they need food and things like that. The issue around how institutions focus on enrollment and completion, that's where the incentives are. That's where institutions get their revenue, right? It's where students are enrolled, and for all kinds of reasons, and other accountability mechanisms are focused on enrollment and completion. How we think about incentivizing institutions to think about employment is harder, right? It's trickier. We know that outcomes can play out over a long time, and just how we do that in a way that really creates intended consequences with minimal unintended consequences is more complicated.
So let's build on what Laura just shared there for a last question on a broad question. I mean, we've been, as an industry, talking about the pace of increase in student debt and the crisis therein for years. As Wil mentions, there's some policy ideas on the table that could make a big impact, doubling Pell among them. How confident are you all that we will see a major shift in the way students pay and borrow for college that can have a positive impact on what I think most people feel is reaching unsustainable levels of borrowing? And I know that's a broad one, Wil, but why don't you take it wherever you'd like?
I mean, I'm hopeful, not optimistic, right? I think there are a lot of great ideas in the policy space right now, and there are, I think, some opportunities for us to begin to really think about how we create something that is closer to debt-free college. I think that it's possible in the next infrastructure package we see that we'll see maybe free community college as a first step towards getting there. I don't think we'll see student debt cancellation. I don't think we'll see doubling Pell right now, because that's how we're going to pay for free community college. And so I do think there are steps that could be made. But I've said this before: if we don't tackle the problem holistically, all we're going to do is kick the can down the road. And so if we, for example, do student debt cancellation, let's say, all universal debt cancellation, but we don't double Pell, we don't do a federal state partnership that manages the cost of college, if we don't, address accountability, and then in 10 years, we're going to see the exact same problem. And so, I'm hopeful that, we're in a space where there can be some ideas and maybe even some agreement around things, but I'm not sure taking it piecemeal is going to solve the problem.
Absolutely. Let's turn to Courtney and then maybe Nichole if we have time.
Well, I think I'll go back to me, what seems like a clarion call to institutions, which is how do they better support students to connect to careers and good jobs? I'll take it from a slightly different angle than Wil. To me, this is an affordability question of how institutions keep affordability at the forefront, but also offer these career support. So they seem like it might be sort of counterintuitive, right? Because if we're going to provide more support, career support services, then is that going to increase the cost? And that's part of the issue here. So to me, that's like the crux of the implications that we're talking here today, is how can institutions get more creative and do a better job connecting and supporting students to jobs, and do it in a way that's not going to increase costs, and think about and coupling that with just better and clearer communication around cost and ROI. We are at this moment after the pandemic with affordability and loans and questioning that institutions are closing at a higher rate than we've seen in ever, and they're being forced to think about things differently. So I'm hopeful on that front that the market is pushing higher ed institutions to think better, to do better, and ultimately to better serve students.
Thank you. So Nichole has graciously ceded the last words to Dr. Perna. Any last takeaway you'd like to leave us with, Laura?
Oh, thanks, Nichole. I was curious what you were going to say on this. I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. I think we have to be hopeful to stay in this, right? I also I hope that this is a moment where we are going to refocus on how to improve. It is a big problem, right? And it's going to take concerted effort to really improve affordability and address the other barriers to college enrollment, completion, and employment that we haven't even talked about, right? So I hope that this is a moment where we're going to reflect on where we are, reflect on the growing inequality that happened during the pandemic, and have some real investment somewhere on some of this that then catalyzes additional effort to get us where we really need to be as a nation.
Thanks for that. Okay, Nichole, how about a last thought?
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful in terms of that last bit about providing students with the resources and support they need. I think, like Courtney, that we are in an evolution of, first, I mean, not that we're finished fighting battles on access and completion, especially now, we've seen that we aren't, but recognizing that that's not the end game, that we do need to provide students with a payoff at the end that makes their education worth it. And I am hopeful that I'm seeing more recognition of that.
Alrighty, we're at time. Could have kept going on that one for sure. I want to thank Dr. Perna, Wil, Dr. McBeth, Nichole, and Strada for hosting this, but most of all of you for tuning in. We hope this has been valuable. Send us your feedback. I think we're going to send you a link in the chat right now, actually, for a survey on how we can do better on these. And we'll send out the link tomorrow with a recording of the webinar. So thank you all. Cheers.